Here we go. So as a trigger alert, I'm going to talk about things that are a bit horrible, but this is the world we live in. And let's start by talking about anthrax. So you may or may not have been taught about anthrax in your undergraduate degree. This is an infection caused by a bacterium known as Bacillus anthracis, which is a spore-forming organism. It produces these spores which are inactive and can actually survive in the environment, in soil and water, on bits of grass or whatever. When the spores get into the body of an animal or a person, they then become activated. We get the actively growing, what we call the vegetative cells. And those then spread out in the body. They produce toxins and cause severe illness and death. And in fact, when I was in Birmingham, when I first arrived there, I overlapped with a guy called Harry Smith, who was the person that actually discovered anthrax toxin way back in, I think, in the late 40s, early 50s. The two main kinds of anthrax are cutaneous and then inhalational. So cutaneous anthrax, you get these nasty black sores on the skin there that look really quite angry and horrible and do take a bit of time to heal up. But they generally are treatable. Inhalational anthrax is when the anthrax bacillus gets into your lungs and you inhale the spores and they germinate, and then you get these nasty changes. This is a particular characteristic you see on an X-ray called a sort of mediastinal widening, hilar widening that you can see in the X-ray. And inhalational anthrax has a very high mortality rate. It's actually a nasty infection. So even if it's recognised and you get antibiotics in, an appreciable number of people will still go on to die. Now, anthrax as a weapon, Nabil mentioned about, the Ministry of Defence and stuff like that. Well, yeah, there's unfortunately a history of this. So there's a bit of a typo there. It's in the First World War. That I at the end is supposed to be World War I. The German army used anthrax to infect livestock of allies. Japan in the Second World War used anthrax and actually used it in China. In the UK and the US, there was a biological weapons program where there was active exploration of the use of anthrax as a bioweapon. And in fact, they bombed an island in Scotland called Grunyard with bombs containing anthrax spores. They showed that killed 80 sheep on the island, and they left the island contaminated with anthrax for many decades. And in fact, it was only formally decontaminated with formaldehyde and seawater in 1986. So for over 40 years, there was an island up in Scotland that you could not go to because it had been contaminated with anthrax. 1950s, the US expanded their programs because they were involved in the Korean War. They didn't use it in the Korean War, but there was active research going on. Rhodesian and South African forces used it in the apartheid era. In 1979, there was this so-called accidental outbreak. Well, it was an outbreak in Sverdlovsk in Russia. And we now know that it was accidental, and it was related to a Soviet military microbiological facility where they had improper installation of air filters. At the time, the Soviet Union denied that it was anything. They just considered it was a natural event, but it wasn't. In the 1990s, there was a cult in Japan that actually released anthrax spores from the roof of a building in downtown Tokyo in an attempt to try and infect people. I have actually been to Portondown. On one occasion when I went, I met a quote-unquote spy, someone who worked for the intelligence agencies, and he said, actually, the thing to remember is most terrorists are a bit stupid, and they're not that sophisticated. And that obviously applies here, because if you're going to go to the trouble of weaponising anthrax, at least get a strain that's virulent rather than use a vaccine strain. He told me a story about some guy who had wired up a bomb to be activated by his phone and he set off on a motorcycle to go and deliver the bomb where it wanted it to be, but he forgot to switch his phone off, and his mother phoned him while he was driving along, and the bomb went off and blew his leg off. You know, and you hear those kind of stories. In the 1990s also it came to international attention that Iraq had a biological weapons program, and the United Nations inspectors discovered that they had a program including the production of anthrax, which it was claimed could be delivered by missiles, bombs and aerosols. So this is context for our main story. Bit more context. This is a nasty kind of guy, the Unabomber. The name Unabomber comes from an abbreviation of University and Airline Bomber, because this guy sent bombs through the post to people working in universities and in airlines. Turned out it was a guy called Ted Kaczynski, who was a maths prodigy when he was young, and then as he got older he became a bit weirder and went and gave up his academic career and lived this primitive life, kind of living off the grid in Montana. He was active, this span of crimes went on from 1978 to 1995, and he was finally convicted on 10 counts of transportation, mailing and use of bombs, and 3 counts of murder. But the investigation that led to him being convicted was the longest and most expensive in the history of the FBI up till that point. How did he get caught? He got caught because he put out a manifesto, and I think he also wrote some letters, and his brother recognised this funny little phrase that he used, saying, "You can eat your cake and have it." So in contemporary English, we usually say it the other way around. You can have your cake and eat it.
Yeah, but that makes no sense.
It makes no sense, and it actually is a later version. The original version of the phrase was "eat your cake and have it," and his brother said, "Oh, that's the sort of thing that's what Ted always says," because he's very pedantic about that point. And so they tipped off the FBI. Maybe you should look at this guy. FBI went in and they found him. So it was a forensic linguistic clue that gave the clue as to that caught the Unabomber. But also the FBI, you know, a lot of people could say, well, you guys are not very good at your job if it takes you this long to catch someone doing this. We fast forward now to September 11th, 2001. Anyone of my age, I think anyone probably of Nabil's age, I haven't done the experiment, can tell you where they were when this happened. It's one of those defining events of the last century, really, where these... where were you?
I was homesick, I had the flu.
And you saw it on the telly?
So I was watching it on TV the whole time.
Yeah.
And when I came back to school next week, everyone said I'd done it. Because I'd been noticeably absent the whole week.
Yeah.
I was like, oh.
And you have a certain religious background.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not going to ask the Muslims in the room about the effect that this had on their ability to get on with their normal lives in this world. It was a terrible event in many, many ways. I mean, it was a terrible event for what happened to the 3,000 or so people that died that day. As a kind of irony, I was actually here. I was actually in the middle of UEA at a Microbiology Society conference. And you know, we were just warming up for the day, and then suddenly people started looking around the screen. I think it was actually lunchtime by the time it came. And you know, it was just, what is going on? I mean, it's just incredible. A few weeks later, a couple of letters go in the post. And you can see they've got at the top 9/11/01, and you can see that, you know, this is what they say. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. These letters were sent into the American postal system. 4 of these letters were mailed to New York City to various news outlets, media outlets: ABC News, CBS News, NBC News, and New York Post. One of them was mailed to another media outlet, the National Enquirer, and a company called AMI, based in Boca Raton in Florida. They were postmarked as being sent out on the 18th of September, and they contained some coarse brown material, which you can see at the top there. A little while later, 2 more letters were mailed out to 2 US senators, Tom Dashley and Patrick Leahy. These contained a finer powder, which you can see down in the bottom slide there. These letters, when they got into the postal systems, contaminated the postal systems. This is a summary slide which summarizes a huge investigation that was taken on by the FBI, looking at where the anthrax sites, cases were, confirmed ones, suspected ones, where their environmental samples positive. But the key point is that these letters didn't just go in the post and reach someone's desk, and that was that. They contaminated the whole postal system along the way. 22 people developed anthrax that we know about. 11 of them had inhalational form of anthrax, the worst form of anthrax. 31 tested positive in total for exposure, even though some of them didn't become ill. And 10,000 people were judged to have been exposed and took antibiotic prophylaxis because they were at risk of. So whether there probably would have been several dozen more cases if they hadn't been taking the prophylaxis. 5 individuals died of inhalational anthrax. The first of these was a guy, Bob Stevens, based in that news outlet in Florida. There were 2 more that were based in a Mayo facility in Washington, D.C. And then later on there was a Vietnamese immigrant resident of the Bronx and a 94-year-old widow of a prominent judge from Connecticut. And those are the victims. So it's just worth pausing to remember that this was a serious business. People died as a result of this. In terms of the timeline of the events, what I'm doing as I go through this, I'm going to give you some screen dumps, and a lot of the information that I'm giving you actually comes from this document here, which is the United States Department of Justice summary of the investigation into the Amerithrax incident. So Amerithrax is a portmanteau word for American anthrax. And so there were the times when the letters were posted. Bob Stevens developed anthrax. It was an announcement that was made he contracted anthrax. And to begin with, it was just like, what's a weird thing that's just happened? It's just an incidental case, whatever. That's what people were saying in public. Obviously, beneath the radar, the authorities were saying, what's going on here? What's happened? Then those letters were sent out. The letters were opened. They were discovered. Some of them were discovered and recovered by the FBI. These postal employees died. Some time later, another week later, the Kathy and Nguyen died. And then finally, quite late on, there was this final death, believed to be as a result of the contamination in the mail, cross-contamination. So if you're interested to read further, there's the link to the investigative summary, and there's also a Wikipedia page, which is fairly good on all this as well. That investigative summary, I mean, it really does read like a work of detective fiction. It is just a remarkable story, and I'm going to just share with you some of the key points from that. I mean, one of the outcomes is just a huge amount of effort had to go into contamination and cleanup. If you can imagine, just imagine if you were working in one of those postal facilities. I mean, the amount of anxiety that had you been exposed, were you going to get it? But then how do those in charge of the how are we going to decontaminate the working environment so our staff can go back to work? And it cost multi-million dollar cleanup went on. The Brentwood facility, mail facility, was closed for 2 years, and 1.8 million letters and packages went into quarantine that had been in the postal service, were just put into quarantine. Who got the blame? Well, this man was President of the United States at the time, George W. Bush, and very quickly he pointed the finger in two different directions. So initially it was like Iraq. Iraq is behind the anthrax outbreaks. It's clearly that this guy Saddam Hussein, he's the evil man. This is wrong. This is it. And you know, this is a news article from the time. You know, growing mass of evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved. Well, that's one way of looking at it. The US authorities also obviously knew who was behind the 9/11 event. That was Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and so they pointed the finger in that direction as well. They kind of never seemed to get it clear in their heads that these two individuals were actually very different kinds of people with different philosophies about the world. The idea that was thrown around at the time of the Iraq War was maybe they were working together. It's a weird idea. Anyone know what kind of philosophy Saddam Hussein had? Political philosophy? It was a movement called the Ba'athist movement in the Arab world, and it was a secular movement. It was a pan-Arabist, like all Arabs should live together in a secular state. Very little interest in religion, and Saddam Hussein, you know, within his government, he had Christians, there were Jews in Iraq. Osama bin Laden, on the other hand, was a jihadi Muslim who believed that non-Muslims were, you know, people that needed to be got rid of from influence within the world. So very different agendas. Anyway, an award went out to try and, so concerned were they to find the perpetrator. A $2.5 million award went out there, placed quite quickly. Okay, we mentioned the Unabomber. That was just a warm-up act for the FBI investigation that went into the Amerithrax incident. 600,000 investigator hours, over 10,000 interviews on 6 continents, 26,000 email reviews, 80 searches, 6,000 items of potential evidence, 5,750 grand jury subpoenas, 5,730 environmental samples. Over 1,000 suspects were considered in the inquiry, 29 labs. And the key point is that the people who are actually helping the FBI, the experts in this, were also the same kind of people, the Lizzie Coys of the age. They were experts, but they were also suspects. So I'm pulling your leg, you're not going to tell me off, are you? But yeah, that was the issue. Like, because the average FBI agent doesn't know anything about bacteria, does he? He's going to have to go to the experts. Interesting twist in the story was just a short while before all this guy here, Paul Keim, an American microbiologist, had started looking at the population genetics and genomics of Bacillus anthracis and developed a nifty molecular typing system that would allow people to understand and detect the genetic relationships between different strains of Bacillus anthracis. So Paul Keim was actually there and ready, the right man at the right time, and the FBI sent their samples to him. Paul Keim actually reflects on this in later life. He's written up his experiences. And he said, on October the 4th in 2001, it was sundown when I drove to the commercial airport Flagstaff. The airport officials let me drive out onto the tarmac. I watched the jet land. An attractive blonde woman got off with a box containing the culture. It was a surreal experience. I felt like Humphrey Bogart in a scene from Casablanca. I put the box in my car and drove right back to the lab. This is highly dramatic stuff. He took it back to the lab. He ran his tests. I don't know how many of you know what the answer was. The strain was identified as the Ames strain. It's a commonly used lab strain isolated from a sick cow in Texas in 1981. It's not a strain that's come from Afghanistan, that's come from Iraq. It's a common lab strain, probably the most commonly used lab strain among anthrax researchers, and it comes from America. What this meant was that the culprit was likely to be a homegrown microbiologist, the microbiological equivalent of the Unabomber, some kind of person with a grudge, weird person, probably based in America, that was behind all this. Keim did say afterwards that he didn't actually stop the Iraq War, but by showing that this was an American homegrown strain, he said he did delay it for 2 years. Because the Bush administration were blaming Saddam Hussein, and they were trigger happy, they were ready to go into Iraq. And if this had gone the other way, they would have gone in. But the fact it turned out that there was no evidence that Iraq was involved from the microbial genetics analyses held them back.
Yeah, they came up with a different excuse.
George W. Well, they used the Amerithrax incident as a pretext as well. George W. Bush just had a grudge. His father had sort of started a war and not quite finished it. There was a previous Gulf War where they got the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but they didn't do the regime change, and so it was setting a grudge. But that's beside the point. And in fact, Colin Powell did use the fact that this anthrax in the postal system in the US caused all these problems. He said, Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 litres, which would have been enough to fill tens and tens of thousands. This very dramatic language, this was actually used as a way of justifying the Iraq War. But anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves there. Let's get back to 2001. Here's just a list of some of the suspects that the FBI had in their sights. And you can see there was, it was a job of work for them to try and narrow this down. There were so many people. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but let's just pick the odd one. A scientist with an arguable financial motive to commit the attacks who travelled to New Jersey around the time. A researcher against whom the FBI received several tips that he or she fitted the publicised profile and had a grudge against the United States. A microbiology student who allegedly had associations with Al-Qaeda's anthrax program. Alleged anthrax program. There was never an Al-Qaeda anthrax program. They actually spent a lot of time focusing down on the wrong guy. They decided that this guy, Stephen Hatfill, was a person of interest to the task force. And they got, there were several people that all pointed the finger. He had access to the AIM strain. He appeared to know the intricacies of how you might put it in the mail. But then, lots of other people could have thought about that as well. And he had prescriptions for Cipro, which was the only thing that you could use that was accepted as a treatment to prevent or to treat inhalation anthrax. But it turned out that he wasn't the right guy. That was consistent. In fact, he had a particular infection and he had legitimate reasons to be taking Cipro at the time, and they recognised that he was the wrong guy. So how are we going to solve this? Let's have a look. What did the FBI do? Let's have a look. Well, let's have a look at these letters to start with, okay? I've shown you those letters already. Some of you may have noticed some interesting linguistic features of these letters. Some of you may not. Let's have a look. So it says, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. So that's pointing, that's like, these are for Muslims, aren't they? Clearly. They must be a Muslim. So although even if they're working in the US, they must be one of them Muslims with all that stuff. It plays into this Islamophobic trope that was on at the time. All it shows you is that whoever was sending those letters wanted to try and make that link, pretend that link was there. And if you notice the phrase "Allah is great," this is what it says in the FBI report. The perpetrator was a homegrown attack and supported by the statement "Allah is great." And the argument is that a true jihadi, in fact, your average Muslim on the street, wouldn't say Allah is great. The FBI said that they'd say Allah Akbar. Did you accept this argument? Ish?
Yeah,
Do you accept this
Yeah,
argument?
you tried it out on me without giving me the context, and I was like, that's not Allah's greatest. I was like, that doesn't sound right to me.
Exactly. So either you keep it all in Arabic, or you translate it all. You know, Allah is just the Arabic name for God. It's the name that Christian Arabs use for God as well. It's not a specifically Muslim word. But here we can show that the FBI, they're a bit crap, really. They haven't done their homework, have they? Because what's wrong?
In which one?
The last bit.
Akbar.
It's not right. It's so wrong.
You?
There's a you missing. Yeah, exactly. The nominative form of Allah in a sentence like that is Allahu.
Yeah.
And the statement is Allahu Akbar, which is known as the takbir in Islam. It's a phrase that's used all the time in Islam. In the call to prayer, Sufi people, musicians make songs out of it. It's a very common phrase. But it's not Allah Akbar, it's Allahu Akbar. One other subtle point, which again, as Muslims you might be able to tell us if this is true. Nobody will put this down as a postscript. Where does it belong in any statement? When you do the call to prayer?
Let's say it first.
You say it first. It's the most important statement in the universe for a devout Muslim. They wouldn't chuck it on at the end as a postscript. So all of this trashes the idea that this was Muslims sending these letters. It was someone pretending, playing the game. Whether they were seriously trying to put the authorities on the false trail or whether they were just mucking about. But give it to the FBI, they did actually realise that that was the case. But let's have a look again at the letters. So are there any more linguistic clues there? Is there anything funny about this particular letter? Let's take someone you're a native speaker of English. Have a look at that. Is there anything that, when you read that, is there anything wrong?
Something spelt wrong.
Something spelt wrong.
I don't know how you spell it, but it's spelt wrong.
What's spelt wrong?
Penicillin.
Penicillin is spelt wrong.
You've asked a dyslexic to do a spelling.
Oh, okay, sorry, I didn't realise that. But yeah, okay. So penicillin is misspelt. It's all capitalised. That's not, in ransom notes and stuff, you do that to hide your handwriting. But let's see. That lady over there looks like she's got some insight.
It looks like someone tried to write it with like their left hand or with their non-dominant hand. Because the word, like they've got, do you know what I mean? Like
They're trying to hide their handwriting. Yeah, that's probably reasonable. But are all the letters the same? In the way they're written? Some of them look. Some of them are in bold. They've been boldened up, haven't they? They've been made bolder.
Yeah.
So what have we got? We've got T, T, A. Then we've got, what's the next? Let's have a look. If we look at the ones that are in bold, can anyone see a pattern there? What does that sound like? How might you interpret that after 3 weeks of sitting to listen to people like me prattling on?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a DNA sequence, isn't it? Looks like it to me. Now, you all did an aptitude test. What kind of things can you do with a DNA sequence?
We can detect like what's the amino acid sequence.
Have a look now on your. I put the genetic code there on the things. Anyone want to read out what this translation of this is? What's TTT as a code on? What does that translate? PHE, phenylalanine. So it's PHE in the 3-letter code. Single letter code? F.
S.
Okay. AAT, asparagine, single letter code.
No, that's not true.
N. Okay. And then the final one there, TAT is tyrosine, single letter code. Y. Okay. So we've got FNY, if we read it one way. If we read it the other way, and we take the first letters, does anything come out there? And what's PAT mean? What do you think that is? It's a woman's name, yeah. So we've got two possible interpretations there. FNY. What do you think FNY would mean? Average English speaker throwing that around? Something new. He's so polite. Come on, you're not polite. What does it mean?
Oh, F-U.
Okay. And PAT is a woman's name. Okay. So we got two potential meanings hidden within the genetic code, hidden within the letter.
But then just you see, it has to be someone that knows genetic code then to be writing it. If it's going to be that way.
Yeah. So, but all of you know the genetic code. You're all microbiologists. You all know about it.
Have a high school biology graduate.
But you'd have to be a bit weird to be doing this, though, wouldn't you?
It's been very weirdly thought through.
Exactly. It's very weirdly thought through, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, that was just a... I'm not going to tell you the answer to that linguistic clue yet. Keep it in your mind. So at the moment we're thinking a non-Muslim American, someone working in America who's not a Muslim. What about genetic evidence? Which is, why we're here. We'll talk about bacteria. Forensic linguistics is an interesting subject, but that's not what you're here for. By late November 2001, what people could see was that when you streaked out the culture from the letters, you could see, just with the naked eye, that some of those colonies looked different. There was a small subpopulation of colonies that showed different colonial morphotypes, as we call it. And the investigators, FBI scientists, they started to think, well, could we actually use those mutations, or any mutations genetically, to identify the source of this material? So could we actually go and sequence the genome, maybe, of this strain and see what it looks like? Now, you have to think back to when this was. This was at a time when there was only probably, I can't remember whether it was half a dozen or a dozen bacterial genome sequences had been completed. Bacterial genome sequence was in its infancy. This is the morphotype. These are the morphotypes that were seen. And so you can see that there are just, when they were plated out on agar, they just looked sufficiently different. And they came up with these morphotypes A, B, C, D, and E. And there was these descriptions there as to how they look, and whether they're able to sporulate or not sporulate. So it turned out that many of them couldn't sporulate these particular morphotypes. So this idea was floating around, just why don't we sequence the genome or do something like that? Why don't we look at the wild type and maybe look at these individual variants and we can see some clues in there? The counter-argument was, well, you have no idea whether those morphotypes have any genetic basis. It could be just a random kind of phenotypic variation. And even if you wanted to go and find out what was causing those mutations, those different... This is unheard of. Nobody's sequenced multiple strains from the same species and looked at that. And you know, the test didn't exist in 2001. People dismissed it. They said this is Star Wars stuff. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. It's just not possible. But the FBI decided that they were going to do it. They were going to push the boundaries of what was available in science at the time. People had died. This was a clear and present danger. They needed to sort it out. And so they went forward. So whatever else you say about the FBI and their investigations, you know, they were brave in pushing forward the frontiers of science. So the first paper that came out was this paper. They basically got the people at the Institute of Genomic Research, TIGER as it was called, who had the set up to sequence genomes. They got them to sequence a strain grown from the letter, the wild type, and the Ames strain, the original strain that people held in their labs. You can see the paper here. Tim Reed is an English guy who was working in America, still works in America, in fact. He's now at Emory University. He drives around a little Mini with a Union Jack on the roof. And interestingly, coming back to what we were saying earlier in the week, when I said that water was the one word in Hittite that was so conserved that you could still see it, I asked him, oh, you've still got an English accent after being in the US for a decade or more. Do you have any trouble with people understanding you? And he said, only one word. He says, when I ask for water, they don't understand me. I have to say, can I have some water? And then they understand him. So it's kind of weird. Anyway, Tim Reed was the head of that. Claire Fraser, who was Craig Venter's wife at the time, and she was the head of the genome sequencing unit there.
Some will, this is contentious, but some will say Claire's the brains out of the two, the real genius.
Yeah, and she certainly wouldn't thank anyone for reminding the world that she was his wife at that time. Paul Kime, also on the paper. And to cut a long story short, they got a science paper out of it, but they had to put their hands up in the air and say, well, actually, we haven't found any differences between the outbreak strain and Ames. So we can't, although we found a few SNPs between different strains of anthrax, we cannot help here by telling you what's going on with the wild type majority variant in the letters and the Ames strain. And so they put out this scenario of, you know, it could have, the Ames isolate went to Fort Detrick, it was known what its history was, it then got distributed to various labs, including Porton Down in the UK, and they were able to show that it was distinct from the Porton Down variants, but it wasn't distinct from the attacks. The attack strain was the same as the ones that have been seen in other labs. And so that didn't get us anywhere. And they subsequently came out with a more detailed paper where they described the Ames, Bacillus anthracis Ames strain in more detail, and went through and did all the things that we've been talking to you about. They went through and looked at every gene. They did homology searches. They compared this genome with other genomes and so forth. They even cited one of my papers in that paper, which I was quite pleased about, and took it forward. So again, they were pushing forward the boundaries here. Probably anthrax wouldn't have been a priority if this hadn't happened. It would have been a bit later. Now, in my life, something strange happened around this time. I got this invitation to go to Florida from November the 7th to the 8th to go to a meeting in Key Largo in Florida, a very lovely tourist resort. All my expenses are paid, flown over there. You can see there's a stretched limo that picked me up. It's Mark Uckman, who used to be his boss. I met him there. We went out on a boat and watched the reefs there. And this meeting, this is the report from it. I actually found it when I was clearing out at home. I met David Relman, who I've mentioned before, who was there. Stan Falco. I sat shooting the breeze with Stan Falco, having a nice drink. He was in charge of the discussion group. And we said, well, what are we all doing here? He said, all you needed to say, he says, is just to say that we should sequence more and more bacterial genomes. In fact, sequence all the common lab strains of everything so that if Amerithrax happened again, we'd know where it was coming from. Just tell us that, and then we can just go and have a drink. This is a very strange meeting. What's going on here? Got towards the end of the meeting. You can pass that round. There we go. Got towards the end of the meeting, just as about to finish the meeting, this Tunisian American said, I mean, we'd been invited there by, supposedly by the American Academy of Microbiology. And he said, this is not an American Academy of Microbiology. This is nothing. This is CIA have paid for this. I said, what? And I remembered on the first day when everyone introduced themselves, there were all these people working in microbial genomics, and then this guy gets up and says, I'm so-and-so, I'm from the CIA, and I'm here to look after him. And then the other person gets up and says, I'm here from the FBI, and I'm here to keep an eye on him. So there was a slight weirdness about it. And the Tunisian American, he said, this is not funded by American federal government. I said, why did you say that? He said, they've paid our bar bills. American federal government never pays bar bills. But they've just paid all our bar bills. This is CIA. Wow, okay. It seemed to me a bit of a conspiracy. Really? I've been brought over here by the CIA to this meeting, and it's all been paid for. I mentioned it to David Relman quite a few years later. I said, oh, you know, that meeting that you helped organise. I also met Rich Roberts, actually, who was a Nobel laureate, English guy living in the US, who set up New England Biolabs, you know, more or less discovered restriction enzymes. But yeah, David Relman said, yeah, I thought everyone knew it was a CIA-sponsored meeting. And just, excuse me, and if you look in the bloody report, indeed, it says, the American Academy of Microbiology is grateful for the generous support of the following: National Science Foundation, Central Intelligence Agency. So it was true all along. There we are. I've been employed by the CIA. That was the kind of world we lived in those days. Amerithrax was a clear and present danger. They grabbed us all there. And what they were looking to do was just to rubber stamp a recommendation that they'd already developed, that they wanted money from the federal government to go and sequence everything they could and take this investigation forward, but also future-proof things going forward. Yeah, so the FBI were there, CIA both there. Anyway, that was just an aside. They then, things went forward where they started to look at the morphological variants and sequence their genomes. Again, really pushing the boundaries. This time Dave Rasko was heading it. I met Dave Rasko. I've only met him once, and that was after we had our paper in New England Journal on the German STEC outbreak. He had a paper in the same issue where he'd used PacBio to sequence the outbreak strain genome, and he happened to be in Birmingham a short while later, and so we shared a drink together to celebrate our success. Jacques Ravel, who was the driving force between this particular study, is now the editor of the journal Microbiome, and the only dialogue I had with him recently was to send him a snotty email complaining that they'd sat on our paper for 4 months. But he's one of the heroes. I mean, basically, you know, that's a minor quibble. These people are heroes because they actually push the boundaries. And if you can imagine it, you're coming into your lab, you're doing all this lab work. It's not like normal life. Lives are depending on this. The FBI are looking over your shoulder. What you do has evidential capacity. So it was just incredible that these guys got on and they did it. And they basically identified 4 loci with variable genetic mutations. And in fact, they were able to provide a biological explanation of why these variants were there and didn't sporulate. And they showed that none of them were present in normal cultures that people supplied of anthrax. They were just present in the letters, in the morphotype size state from the letters. And they weren't present in the environment. So this is a line taken from their paper. This study demonstrates the forensic value of systematic microbiological analysis combined with whole genome sequencing and comparative genomics. So again, pushing the boundaries. Where does this lead us? Well, Oh, that's just to show you that they were able to develop PCRs based on the genomes, so that they could then use, obviously, if they wanted to screen a large bank of potential sources of the strains using the letters, they don't want to genome sequence them all. They developed PCRs to look for these particular mutants, these morphotypes, and they could actually tie in, as I say, the biology of these morphotypes to the genome, to the SNPs in the genome, and show that they were related to sporulation. So while all this was going on, the FBI had already built a database of AIM samples for comparison to the evidential material, which they called the FBI repository, or FBIR. They got over 1,000 samples, which pretty much represented every AIMS culture in every lab that they'd ever identified on the planet as having the AIMS strain. And they went in and they did these 4 genetic assays. These were presence or absence. It was a PCR band was there or not. They didn't quantify it, but nonetheless they detected it. And they found that there were 8 of these submissions that tested positive for those mutations. And using various submission records, they determined that these 8 samples were derived from a single source, known as RMR 1029. There it is. It's a flask containing a culture of spores from a culture of Bacillus anthracis. Who did it belong to? It belonged to this individual here, a guy called Bruce Ivans. It was found in his lab. And who is Bruce Ivans? Well, Bruce Ivans was a senior microbiologist in the bacteriology division of an organisation that's commonly called US AMRID, United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, in Fort Detrick in Maryland. So he was a leading US expert in the growth, sporulation and purification of Bacillus anthracis. He'd actually been working on anthrax at US AMRID since 1980. So he was a experienced veteran of the field. He had been doing that kind of stuff over 20 years. He had extensive knowledge of anthrax production protocols. He was adept at manipulating anthrax production and purification variables to maximize sporulation and improve the quality of spore preparations. He understood how to aerosolize, to get the dosage rates for aerosolization. So he did animal experiments, producing these batches to test on vaccinated animals to determine they would have to inhale a predefined dose of a challenge dose of anthrax spores to assess the efficacy of the vaccine. So there was, a lot of prima facie evidence to make you think, oh, hang on, this might mean something here. Of course, there were others who were working on anthrax, probably not in the hundreds, probably in the dozens who actually, or somewhere between half dozen, a dozen, or something like that were similar, experience. There was an anthrax research field. But the FBI put together lots of evidence to point the finger. And so, just as I say, it's like a detective fiction here. What was his means, motive, opportunity? What was the opportunity? What they concluded was that he had this particular spore batch created by himself. It was a parent material, they said, and on the days leading up to each of the mailings, they checked his whereabouts, and he was working alone at night in the lab where that particular flask was stored. He had the sophisticated lab equipment to grow, harvest, and store the anthrax. He was not in the habit of working late most of the time. So this pattern of working late in the lab around those times was a bit unusual. And he was one of the few who actually had the opportunity, had the knowledge to do it. And they said everyone else who had access to that particular flask couldn't have been the mailer because they lacked the ability or the opportunity to prepare and store the material. So that was one line of evidence. What about his motive? Well, according to his emails and friends, statements he made to friends, in the months leading up to that event, he had been under intense personal and professional pressure. He'd been working on an anthrax vaccine program. He'd devoted more than 20 years to doing it. But it looked like the funding for that was going to get pulled, particularly because the vaccines that were being produced, these anthrax vaccines, were implicated in what was called Gulf War syndrome. So many soldiers who'd been implicated been in the Gulf War were getting a kind of rather non-specific kind of illness, and one of the potential culprits was all those vaccines that they had received, including the anthrax vaccine. And he was concerned that his research program was going to get closed down. Once the anthrax attacks happened, his program was suddenly rejuvenated. And suddenly research on anthrax was back in fashion in a big way. He also had profound mental health struggles. It made statements. He was a man driven by obsessions, homicidal tendencies. He posted violent messages on the internet. He'd made threat, dating back to his graduate days of homicidal threat. A psychiatrist had said he was homicidal, sociopathic individual. He had proximity to the source of the envelopes. They worked out that the envelopes had come from a batch that had been sold in Frederick, Maryland and the surrounding communities. So just a few blocks from his home. Kind of points the finger. The language used in the letters. So he had already started to point the finger in his emails about Osama bin Laden. He put this 9/11/1 at the top of the letter. Just reminded me of something else. I can't remember if I put it in this or not, actually. But we'll come back to 9/11/01 in a moment if I forget to say it. Also suggested there was a link to Al-Qaeda. We have this death to America, death to Israel. And then they pointed out, there were those letters with their A's and T's, considering there was a hidden code. And he was particularly fond of a book dealing with codes. And these A's and T's, as it says, both letters significant in genetics, in the DNA code. And we'll say more about the book in a minute. Well, we'll say more about the book now. So, here is the book. Let's give it to you as our putative terrorist. Do you want to just open it? There's a couple of pages turned where there's the corners being turned down. Tell us what you see on those pages. Show everyone.
People doing bold letters.
Bold letters, yeah. So there's bold letters to summarise a code. And what else is there? Oh, the genetic code is in the book. It's quite difficult to summarise what the book's about. It was a cult classic when I was at university. The basic underlying premise is that there are kind of meanings within things that are kind of on the surface, and there are things that are hidden, and that there are patterns that you can see in mathematics, art and music that kind of look similar. And within the book there's lots and lots of puzzles and theorems and challenges to the reader. It's a very odd book. It's a challenging and interesting book. When I was your age or slightly younger, I got about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through it. I never made it to the end. Maybe one of these days in my retirement, or maybe even now, I might try and force myself to get to the end, but it's a very strange book. So this is from the FBI, the Department of, the legal investigation. So they said that, there's this frame message, there's these T's. You look at those T's, take those out, you get these amino acids, and you get you can translate those, and you get 3 amino acids. This is the part of the book, if you want to pass it around, that shows the bolding of things there. And as a way of trying to keep you awake, is anyone awake enough to realise what it's saying here? So what he actually says is, he adds that I think in the next line or two says -1, and then there's those bolded things. So what happens if you applied a -1 to the clue that you see there? Do you come up with a word that might be recognisable in English? Yep.
Yeah, so
The bold letters, C-O-T, canter. What does canter mean? No, it's just Latin for singer. And the thing here is that cantor, this is exactly the sort of humour, the twist you get in that book. Cantor is the name of a famous mathematician, surname of a famous mathematician. So all the others are mathematicians, and then this other mathematician's hidden on the diagonal there. But cantor is also a post that Bach held as part of his professional activities. And so it's one of those things. So the idea that we've got these two messages, we've got FNY and we've got PAT. FNY, fuck New York. Apologise for swearing, but you know, that's what it is. Ivan's had a deep hatred for New York. He sent an email where he said, typical New Yorkers overplaying the tragedy after 9/11, you know. Pretty horrible thing to say, isn't it? And then he also had a colleague who knew from New York, and he'd been giving her a lot of hassle, and this is perhaps one more hassle that he was. The other thing, there were two female colleagues that he kind of gave hassle to. The other one was called Pat, a woman called Pat Fellows, and he had a particular interest in her, almost stalking her. So, you know, maybe we're overthinking this. Maybe we're reading too much in, or maybe there were these things were hidden in those letters, and the fact that there were two meanings that you could take, maybe that's the sort of thing that exactly applies to Gerd, Lesher and Buck. But what about Gerd, Lesher and Buck? So there are many statements that made evidence. So in the days followed the search of his home, which his home was searched in 2007, they went and had a look in his rubbish, in his trash. And they watched him as well. And on one particular day, on the November 8th, just after 1 a.m., he came out wearing long underwear, and he went and threw this, basically walked to the garbage cart. Once the garbage, he went back in again, he went into the house, and he threw this book away. And why would he want to throw away this particular book unless there was something in it that kind of incriminated him? And so the FBI sort of saw that as like, this is evidence that he recognises that he's got an obsession with that book, and he's got an obsession with that sort of stuff. Anyway, I'm nearly finished now. There's a whole number of other things. This is a long report. I'm not going to go through them all of the things that he did. He had a particular obsession with false identities. He tried to stay ahead of the investigation. He had an obsession with these things called sororities, which are female kind of sisterhoods that they have in universities there, and a particular sorority called the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority, and the letters were mailed from a mailbox in front of that in Princeton. Anyway, what happened? Well, the FBI closed the net. They searched his house. They made it clear that they questioned him multiple times. They made it clear to him that he was the prime suspect, and he killed himself. And you can see that he was the same age as I am now, 62, and he went and took a mixture of Tylenol, which is paracetamol mixed with codeine. Horrible way to die, actually, because you know it fries your liver, and then you die from liver failure over a period of days. Short while later, the FBI said that they considered him to be the sole culprit. That there were no other people in their sights. And in 2010, the FBI closed the investigation, and they released this investigative summary saying, here's all the evidence, we're not chasing anyone else. Of course, there was a lot of science, and a lot of people said, you FBI people aren't scientists, what the hell are you doing, all this stuff? So, as a result, they actually asked the National Academy of Sciences of the USA to review the microbial forensic details. They reviewed over 6,000 documents, and they released their own report in 2011, review of the scientific approaches. David Relman, who we mentioned earlier, was a key player in that activity, and I think he was actually the chair of it all. What did the National Academies of Science say? Well, what they said was, it's not possible to reach a definitive conclusion about the origins of Bacillus anthracis in the mammalians based on the available scientific evidence alone. And here's their summary points. That they said that, yeah, it was the AIM strain, there's the morphotypes present, he had the repository, silica, these are things we haven't spoken about, some of these things. Difficult. One of the things that was unclear was to prepare those spores and put them in the post, was that a big deal and took a long time to prepare those? Or was it something you could actually do quite quickly? Nobody could work that one out. It's kind of, nobody'd ever done it before. Basically, they gently criticised the organisational structure and oversight. And they said the goals of forensic science and realistic explanation and limitation regarding its use in the investigation of biological tech must be communicated to the public and policymakers with as much clarity. So they're basically saying that science can only take you so far. This is an article from Wired around the same time, and they said, you know, did the feds nab the wrong guy? Fraser Liggett, as she was then called, Claire Fraser, who headed up the Tiger investigations. This is what she said. She said that she was very proud of what they did, but she said that basically the FBI was smearing out onto her the kind of acceptance was that they were all fully supportive of what the FBI was concluding. She said that, you know, the other thing I didn't say, he was a cross-dresser. They found evidence that Bruce Simon was a cross-dressing, the sorority obsession, the bondage. Very easy to get sucked into all this because it makes for a great tabloid-type story. She said, Ivans was a bit peculiar, but she pointed out in the US of A, one of our civil liberties is to be peculiar. Can't be held against him, it's just anecdote, circumstantial evidence, surely. She pointed out that there were unresolved scientific issues because all this kind of witch's brew, this particular flask contained all sorts of runs mixed together. And we don't know exactly where those mutants originated from. And nobody has tried to reverse engineer it, to say, right, I'm going to take a culture of Ames and see if I can subculture it enough times to get those mutants. And it's an interesting question. Is evolution predictable, or is there an element of randomness in it? And some of you may have heard of the famous Lenski experiments, where a guy called Lenski started off subculturing E. coli in his lab, just repeatedly, time and again, for thousands of subcultures, and looked at what happened. The cultures, each subculture evolved in different ways, acquired different mutations. So we don't know whether, if you subculture the original Ames, whether you'd get the same mutations that they got here, or whether you'd get a completely different set of mutations every time you did it. But without knowing that, it's hard to say, well, this, if you like, genomic fingerprint is evidence. Is it really evidence without that? This is what they said in Wired, and you know, you can see all the circumstantial evidence remains compelling. It'd just be a coincidence that the killer spores were traced back to a single flask, just happened to be overseen by a depressed scientist with occasional violent fantasies. Just a coincidence that he'd screwed up his own anthrax submission to the FBI. That's something I didn't mention, but there was some sleight of hand when they asked him for his cultures. He didn't give them the right ones. It could be a coincidence that he was just working after hours. You know, for the Justice Department, it was enough to prove he was a killer. The irony, as it said here, though, as a result of all this, what actually happened was that loads of people started working, not just on anthrax, but on plague, francisella tularemia, another select agent. And so the chances of something going wrong from people either deliberately taking stuff out of the lab or just having an infection in the lab by mistake, you actually created a more dangerous environment in one sense by doing that. There's something scary, as it says, you know, there's a possibility the government was wrong about all this, but if that was the case, that's an even scarier thought, that the person that did this is still out there and they haven't been caught. So, in closing, was Bruce Ivans, was he innocent and hounded to death by the FBI? That's a serious thing to think about. You may know I wrote a book about smallpox, and the guy who ran the smallpox lab was hounded to his death by the media and took his own life. This is a serious business when you're in the focus there, and but if that's the case, as it said in What, the killer's still at large, which is a terrifying prospect. Was he alone and guilty of mass murder? And not only was he a murderer, but he was a horrible man because he denied all those victims their day in court to prove that. Or was he part, actually, of a wider conspiracy? And the two senators that were targeted, one of them thinks that, it was Bruce Ivans alone and that was it. The other one says Bruce Ivans was involved, but maybe there was more of a conspiracy to it. And it's, just think for a few moments, what would your verdict be if we asked, if you were the jury, not guilty? In English law, that's an option to us. We have to say it's not guilty or guilty. In Scottish law, there is another option called not proven, which means that you haven't proven they're guilty, but you haven't proven they're not guilty either, and you leave it open. And the key point in English case law, English common law, I should say, is for someone to be found guilty of a crime, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Not just on if it's a civil claim, if someone sued you for infecting that Tory conference, they would only have to prove beyond the balance of probability that it was more likely to be you than not. But for a criminal court of law, you have to prove beyond. So, there we are. You decide. What do you think? Anyone want to say he was not guilty? Anyone want to say he was guilty? Anyone want to say, shut up, it's time for us to go home?
With such a mass of evidence, that's acceptable, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It
Why
was
would
a
you
very
throw
weird
out that book?
coincidence, but then it's also like,
Innocent until proven guilty.
yeah.
Why would you be acting so
Yeah.
suspiciously?
Why would you throw out the book if you were innocent?
Yeah, but
But if you
if you ask,
The FBI were like wanting someone to get it pinned on, or not pinned on, but like
They
finish it.
needed a person,
Yeah.
needed an
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, exactly.
They could have listened to him.
and you sitting around the table, as far as I can see, and this is a first impression, all seem fairly normal, adjusted people. Yeah, you know among yourselves whether that's true or not. Let's ask Nabil, your impression of academics, and particularly bioinformaticians, are they prone to have strange interests, strange behaviours? Are they a little bit
Scientists are quirky.
quirky?
Between quirky and then having
And
like
obsessive
obsessive
tendencies.
and like thinking about murdering people.
Yeah, the
Which is
homicidal, I wouldn't
tendencies.
say I
Yeah,
figured
Yeah, you're right.
Homicidal
I think we can agree that the vast majority of academics are not homicidal.
But they
but-
are,
but-
most are odd
Well,
in some way, because
yeah.
it's a very intensive line of
Yeah,
work, and
exactly.
you need that to...
So to be on the autism spectrum, you have to have two characteristics. One is that you're not good with other people, and the other is that you have strange and obsessive interests. Some people would say that coming here and learning about bioinformatics when you could be watching football is evidence you've got strange and, perverse interests, compulsive, There is a fine line here. In fact, Simon Baron-Cohen, who's done a lot of work on autism, one of his early papers was to show that people with autism usually have a relative who is an academic. And there's a predominance among academics who are engineers and mathematicians among the family members. So, yeah, it's all out there. In conclusion, whether you don't want to come to a conclusion or whether you think Bruce Ivans is guilty or not guilty, Amerithrax provided an interesting and innovative test case for microbial genetics in general and for forensic microbiology in particular. Nowadays we do it differently because we are so much, that it would be a trivial thing that you could do in your lab. So I'm not saying make the straight. I'm saying you could do the genomics to solve the case in your lab within a day or two. You know, you and Dave together could sort this out. If you're interested by what I've said, and you've got a Netflix account, Netflix have just actually released a new documentary on this, which is I found it quite interesting. It's called the Anthrax Attacks. There's the URL for it, and you can see Paul Kime talking about this if you want to see what he actually looks like in real life, plus 20 years on from these events. So that's it. That was I hope you found that interesting, and it was. And I haven't disturbed anyone with the way in which I've presented it.